Hello everyone. So this young 14-year-old Turkish player Erdoğmuş is literally destroying the former world champion Veselin Topalov. All right, so let's start with the first game. Erdoğmuş has white and starts with the pawn queen. He plays d4. Topalov replies with king f6. c4, the pawn the wing pawn that comes to control the central square d5. Black play e6, king f3, and black push to d5 to contest the center. And here Erdoğmuş plays klc3. He leaves his pawn on c4 because the pawn is quite easy to recover. Topalov doesn't take it right away. He's going to prepare to capture it so he can keep that pawn a bit later. Because if you take on c4 immediately, there would already be queen a4 check, the fork, or even the push of the pawn to e, so that the bishop attacks the pawn on c4. And Topalov wants to take this pawn on c4 under better circumstances. He's going to play pawn to c6. That way, in case of a capture, he can protect the pawn with b5, which itself will be protected by c6. So it's entirely possible for white to play e3, even if it closes the diagonal of the bishop on the dark square. It opens the diagonal of the bishop from Kasemonj to protect the pawn on c4. But Erdoğmuş goes into the most critical variation. He plays bishop to g5. He pins the black knight, but he leaves the pawn on c4. So first there's h6, the bishop retreats to h4 to maintain the pin and the capture on c4. And now black are able to keep this pawn by pushing b5. Especially since Erdoğmuş doesn't even try to stop this b5 move, for example, with a4. He plays e4. He immediately asserts himself in the center. The central pawns duo then, he frees the bishop to take the pawn, c4. But now black are able to play b5. They will first play g5 to push back the bishop, bishop g3, then b.5 to keep the pawn. But this extra pawn for Veselin Topalov comes at a price. It's that white have a better center of pawn. As for the black king, since there are pawn pushes with the pawn b to b5 and the pawn g to g5, the black king won't have a very good shelter in this game. r2, play, bishop e2. He plans to shelter his king with kingside castling. Even though it's true that we have to watch the pawns on h6 and g5 and therefore their ability to advance, which could chase away the white pieces and maybe destroy the shelter of the white king. We'll see if that's possible. Black are playing for now. Bishop b7. Knight comes to e5, knight comes to d7, kingside castling. And indeed, black play h5, protected by the knight and the rook. Looking to play h4 and trap the bishop on the black square. But knight takes, queen recaptures. And now that the knight on e5 has been exchanged, the bishop has this e5 square. So we no longer fear the move h4 in the same way. Queen c1, played by r2, comes to attack the pawn on g5. Black play rook g8. Queen e3, we defend the center. h4 attacking the bishop, but it comes to f5, as we mentioned. The queen comes to d8 to protect the knight. h3 to secure the square g4, so that black can't break through with the g4 lever. You might say they can still do it. There's the knight, the rook. Except that if black play g4, we'll first exchange the knight on f6, then win the pawn on g4. That's why Topalov will play knight d7. The bishop quietly retreats to h2. Queen b6. We can expect Veselin Topalov to look for the queenside castling, since the kingside castling obviously seems complicated for black. Especially since the rook has moved. It's not even possible anymore to shelter the king on the king side. So either the king stays in the center or he does queenside castling and takes refuge on the queen side. And here Erdoğmuş plays rook d1. After all, the rook on f1 wasn't doing anything, so he brings it into the defense of the center. And now black will play e5, and we'll try to understand why black are starting a central fight when their king is still in the center. What would have happened, for example, if the black king had done queenside castling? He didn't do it in the game, but the variation is interesting. We have to look at it. On queenside castling, there would be the move a4, with the idea that if black play a6, we play b3, and there is a lot of pressure on the structure. And that's why Erdoğmuş was afraid to do queenside castling, because there would be a lot of pressure with the files that could open up to the detriment of his queen, his king. That would lead to some beautiful attacks. And after this move, a4, there's a variation that amused me. It's if black respond with b4, attacking the white knight. Well, in that case, you might think the knight is going to move, but actually, no. a5, a counterattack on the queen, which doesn't have the c7 square because of the bishop. So the only square for the queen is the a6 square. And here the winning move for white, a move that's not easy to find. You had to see it in advance, but it's the move b3. We leave the knight. We're not afraid of the capture on b3 because there's the queen. And if black take the knight, in any case, bishop takes c4, and look, the queen has no square. It's trapped in this position. And so they're going to try to play e5. Why? Because they're waiting for only one thing, for white to capture on e5. Because if there's a capture on e5, of course, there will be an exchange of queens and the tripling of the pawns. A monstrous pawn structure for white, with tripled and isolated pawns, and bishop on c5, which could even attack the e3 pawn, by the way. So after this push to e5, Erdoğmuş, of course, doesn't capture on e5. He plays bishop to g4. And here he's threatening to take the knight with check to win the pawn on e5 afterwards. Queenside castling wouldn't help black, because you could immediately capture on e5 since the knight is pinned, by the way. If black take on d4, we can recapture with the rook, attack the knight, and soon the other rook will come, and the knight, he is in great distress, and the king still has no shelter. And the center is opening up. So what does Vasilij Topalov do? He plays rook to d8, and here Erdoğmuş could simply play bishop takes knight and win this pawn on 5. He wins an important pawn in the center, the black king is left without shelter, and the position is of course better. But Erdoğmuş wants much more. And you'll see that his variation might not be optimal against a good defense from Topalov. In fact, Topalov is going to defend well. But it's very clever and very dangerous. Look at what he's doing here. You really have to appreciate Erdoğmuş's creativity. It might not be the best move, but it's very creative. Look, he plays queen f3. So Vasilij Topalov takes on d4, since the queen has left the protection of the pawn on d4. Not only does Erdoğmuş not want to win the pawn on e5, even though he could have, but he leaves his own pawn on d4. And so Topalov takes it. And now the knight is under attack. One might think, but what did he plan? The knight has to move now, right? Well, no, he plays e5. Magnificent. And here there's a trap. If Topalov takes, and here he didn't take, Topalov didn't fall for it. But if Topalov takes, there's the push of the e-pawn to finally open up the black king to threats from a single point. f7 mate. And if black take, it breaks through with the bishop. h5, check, king to d6. And here there are two mates. Queen to f7 mate, but the more elegant mate is the one with the bishops. Bishops d6. The rook protects, and there would be a very beautiful mate. Do you like beautiful mates? Wait a moment. Watch the end of the game. So in this position, as I told you, Topalov didn't fall for it. He didn't take the knight. He played c5 and frees the bishop to attack the queen, not giving time to play. e6. The knight comes to e4. Bishop takes. Queen takes. Bishop e7. Now the push to e6 works less well because of knight f6. Even if you take on f7 with check, king recaptures and the position holds for white. That's why the r2 variation was still less effective than if he had won the central pawn. But he's going to keep trying to create attacks. He plays a 4, trying to destroy this pawn structure on the queen side, this phalanx of 4 pawns, to open the files for his rook. Topalov counters with b4. Queen a2, it attacks the c4 pawn, but d3 attacks the queen that comes to e4, and which attacks the pawn on c4. Knight retreats, the capture of the pawn on c4. Rook to d4 attacks the queen. Queen to b5. Check, the exchange of queens is forced, but it's to open the f-file. Queen takes, pawn takes, and black play. c4. This position looks very dangerous. On the white side with these 3 pawns, plus the rook, this threat to play. c3, having these 2 connected passed pawns on c3 and d3, which will join forces in the march towards promotion, is very dangerous, but there's the capture of the pawn on a 7, opening the file. That's also what Erdoğmuş was aiming for. And now the game is going to become very tactical. Look, c3, b6. We had forgotten, but white have a passed pawn of their own now that the pawn on a7 has been taken. c2 attacks the rook, b7. If black take the rook, we can take back. And after that, black have to deal with the b pawn, which white can support by rook a8 or even goes for the push to e6 to free the bishop on the black square to help their own b pawn reach queen. By the way, the black rook immediately returns to d8. e6 to free the bishop on the black square. Knight takes, rook a8 to try to eliminate the rook and promote to queen. King d7 to connect the rooks on the 8th rank and attack the rook on a8. Defend, of course. The square b8, rook takes d3, check, king c6, bishop f3, check. And here, Topalov makes a mistake, but honestly, it's tough. He goes to c5 and it becomes completely lost with a beautiful sequence. Actually, he should have gone to b6. But why doesn't he go to b6? Because he certainly saw the exchange of rooks. Rook takes. He takes back on b8, check. He doesn't want to come onto the b file and have a check there, actually. That's why he goes instead to the c file. And after rook takes, check. If the king comes to the c file, there will be rook c8 and the win of the pawn. Because even if the knight comes to c7, we can take it. There is the bishop, so we can play rook, take on c7, check. And if the king comes to the file, in any case, we can play rook a8 check, protected by the bishop. Then come back to a1 to block this pawn. And that's certainly the line he didn't want, Topalov, but in reality, even though white have an extra rook, the computer considers this position to be equal. Why? Because there will be bishop to f6, and the pawn on b2 is very difficult to defend with the rook. The idea of playing b3 after taking the pawn on b2, and then having these two pawns that are capable of making a queen, means that white will actually have to sacrifice a piece again to prevent the promotion of these pawns. But as I told you, Topalov doesn't want to go to the b file. He doesn't want to see captures on d8 and the possibility at some point that the pawn b goes with check, so he comes to c5. But on c5, he's going to face a terrible attack. So there is the capture on d8. If black play queen, we can simply return to d1, protected by the bishop. It's always the same. For example, let me show you. After queen, we play rook d1. The black queen is attacked, and we're threatening to take the black rook and also to create a new queen. And if black eliminate the rook, we play rook c8, check. If there's a capture, we recapture with a queen, giving check to eliminate the pawn, c. And if the king comes to d4, then we can eliminate the pawn c. And the pawn b still has that square for promotion controlled by the bishop. So in the game, Veselin Topalov plays kv, the c7. He attacks the rook, trying to shelter his king on the c file. But rook f5 check, and where does the king go now? In the game, it goes to c4. The other possibility is to go to b6. But on b6, look at the sequence. Bishop takes c7, check. And if the king takes queen with check and mate, and he has no other choice but to take the bishop, he cannot take the pawn. There is the bishop on f3, which is protecting. So after rook a5 check, that's why the king doesn't go to b6. It goes to c4. Bishop e2, check. So here, he has no square. He's forced to go to b3. There is no other square. The pawn controls c3, so he goes to b3. Rook d3, check. He is forced to take the pawn on b2 because if he goes to c4, there is an immediate checkmate. You have it, by the way. You can pause the video if you want to find it. A lovely cute mate that ends with the pawn on b3. That you had to think of that little pawn move that gives mate. So as a result, the king eliminates the pawn. But bishop e5 check. The king is forced to go to b1 or c1, but it doesn't change anything because after that, rook a1, checkmate. You see how Erdoğmuş brought the black king down to the first rank and finished by mating with a retreat of the rook to a1. This is not at all the scenario one might have expected when the game was heading to the queen side, with the pawns all the way at the top of the board, and in the end, it finishes with a mate all the way at the bottom of the board. He literally brought it down. So this game was very dynamic and tactical. Now I'm going to show you a more positional and strategic game. Topalov has white and opens with the king pawn. He plays e4, and Erdoğmuş responds with the Sicilian defense, c5. Knight to f3 and g6. Erdoğmuş is playing a Sicilian known as the accelerated dragon variation. That is, he will quickly place the bishop on g7, on the longest dark diagonal of the board. And that's called the dragon variation in the Sicilian defense. The bishop like a fire breather on the long dark diagonal. White play bishop to c4, pawn to d6, and white castle kingside. And you can see the former world champion Topalov, he has developed very quickly nonetheless. The central pawn, the knight, the bishop developed, and already white has castled. Bishop to g7 is therefore played by Erdoğmuş. Rook to 1, knight to f6, pawn to d3, knight to c6, knight to c3, and bishop to g4. Erdoğmuş pins the knight. But after the move h3, the bishop cannot retreat to maintain the pin because there will be the g4 push and the bishop will be trapped. So here, Erdoğmuş chooses to exchange on f3. And this exchange is the first imbalance of the game. It's the first critical moment because in this position now, we no longer have the same balance. Material-wise, meaning we no longer have the same pieces. And from this imbalance, from this asymmetric exchange, plans will emerge. Plans that will persist throughout the game, medium and long-term plans. We're going to try to understand. Certainly, Erdoğmuş no longer has the bishop of the white squares. So he will have to engage the fight more on the black squares, where he has one more piece to fight on the black squares, because both knights are able to fight on both colors. On the other hand, Topalov's bishop of white squares won't be able to fight on the black squares. So Erdoğmuş really does have one more piece to fight on his black squares. And we'll see how he proceeds in the game. But we must not go back to engaging the fight on the black squares without awakening or activating the opponent's bishop of white square that we don't have. And we'll see that Erdoğmuş will very quickly play e6 to hinder this bishop on the white square, to block its diagonals. e6 and even a6, so that the pawns are solid and block any influence from this bishop on the white square. But for now, Erdoğmuş is finishing his development, kingside castling. The queen moves back to d1. In any case, on f3, it was exposed to possible threats from the edge of the board, which would have attacked the queen and the pawn on c2 and would have forced the queen to move back to d1 anyway. And now Erdoğmuş plays e6. There you go. He is currently containing the opponent's bishop on the white square. A 3 is played, a 6. The bishop retreats to a2 because it would have been exposed to the d5 push, which, by the way, happens immediately. There you go, the push to d5. So how is Erdoğmuş going to fight on the black squares? The color of the square, you have a superiority, as I told you. Well, his play will naturally be focused on the long black diagonal and the breakthrough with b4, maybe supported by moves like rook b8, a5, or b4. He will need to attack this knight, attack the pawn on a3, try to open up the long black diagonal. That's how we'll try to start the fight on the black squares on the queen side, because we have the space advantage with black on the queen side, and because the bishop is directly aimed at the queen side. White has the bishop on f4. The knight on h5 attacks. The bishop retreats to e3. So the knight on h5 isn't very well placed, but it can reposition itself. And anyway, that has freed the diagonal of the bishop on the black square. Rook b8 is played. Queen to c1. The queen comes to protect the pawn on b2 because the pawn on b2 can be vulnerable to the b4 push. The knight will be chased away and the pawn on b2 attacked. But the queen on c1 also has an offensive aim, which is to team up with the bishop to go to h6 and try to remove the bishop on g7. However, this plan is not optimal, strategically speaking. But I'll talk about that again in a few moves. Queen d7 is played. Knight d1, so that's to free up the c-pawn. Maybe simply to play c3 to oppose the bishop and try to contain this b4 push. Rook fc8, we can see that Erdoğmuş is placing all his pieces, all his forces on the queen side in anticipation of the upcoming breakthrough on b4. Because in case of an exchange, it could also open the c-file. h6 is necessary. And here one might think, but Erdoğmuş, he's not obliged to exchange the bishops on the black square. He can also retreat to h8. But he will prefer to play knight f6 and let this exchange happen. But in reality, this exchange, it seems interesting for white because we are going to remove the bishop from the black square, which is a precious defender, and who offensively was still bothering white along its diagonal. So it seems like a totally justified exchange. But in the theory of colors, that's not necessarily the case. My former coach, Josef Dorfman, who was also a second to Kasparov, the former world champion Garry Kasparov Josef, Dorfman explained to me that in this theory of colors, when you have a quantitative superiority of pieces to play on the squares, and that's the case here, we have 3 minor pieces to play on the squares against 2, each symmetrical exchange of minor pieces, that is the exchange of bishops, the exchange of knights, only increases the superiority on the squares. Because from 3 minor pieces against 2, if we exchange the bishops, it will be 2 against 1. And if we exchange another pair of knights, black will have a knight capable of playing on the black squares against an opponent's bishop of the opposite color squares, which will be unable to compete on that color of square, whereas the knight can still help defend the white squares. play on the squares, and still defend the white squares. So each exchange of minor pieces in a symmetrical way only increases black's offensive ratio on the black squares. And so that's why Erdoğmuş does not fear the exchange of the bishops on the black squares, which, moreover, breaks the white's pair of bishops. But Topalov came here for that. He came to h6 to exchange the bishops, so he exchanges the bishops and now plays queen f4. The pawn push to e5, still with the aim of hindering the bishop on the white square. e5 is played. The knight retreats to g8. It seems passive to retreat to g8, but it covers all the black squares. h6 and f6 are covered, so the queen cannot infiltrate. And black will simply try to contain the play of white on the king side and now break through on the queen side. Because on the queen side, there is this trio of pawns, even a quartet of pawns, a 5 could come. The two rooks, the queen and the knight, who are ready to launch the offensive. Knight e3 is played. We see that Topalov wants to bring the knight to g4. He wants to try to play the squares h6 and f6. But as we said, there is the knight defending. And even the other knight could also come back to defend. If the black knight is exchanged for the white knight, as I told you, black have one more piece to defend the black squares. So their strategy of setting up their pawn chain with h7, g6, f7, e6, and d5 is very good. They have a very, very good structure on the white squares to completely muzzle the influence of the opponent's bishop on the white square. And they have one extra piece to defend the black squares. So the infiltration of white on the squares, black squares, will not be able to happen in this game. And so b4 is played. That's it. Erdoğmuş breaks through on the queen side. a4. Veselin Topalov tries to block the situation on the queen side. Of course, he doesn't exchange there. Queen d8 is played. Pawn c3. The queen had come to d8 to go to a5. That allows an attack on a4, but the real idea is not to attack a4. Because if a4 is taken, the bishop could move away with the rook, which is revealed, and attacks the queen. But the queen on a5 will allow the attack on the pawn on c3 to be reinforced. White defend with rook to c1. And here, based on what I just explained to you, you might say, but then why does Topalov play rook to c1 to defend the pawn on c3? Of course, but by doing so, he no longer keeps play on the a file. Because now Erdoğmuş could take the pawn on a4, but in reality it's quite subtle from Vestine. Topalov. Erdoğmuş is not going to fall into this trap. Because if you take on a4, the rook, which came to c1, will return to 1. You might ask, why did it leave in the first place? After all, black have won a pawn, but now there's this threat. Bishop takes d5, which is coming, so the black queen can retreat by coming to b5. But that's exactly what Vestin Topalov is looking for the black queen to be on b5, because that would allow c4 to be played. And to have this double lever. That is to say, here, Veselin Topalov will be able to break through black's pawn structure on the white square with the attack from the pawn, the knight, and the bishop, without Erdoğmuş being able to block this situation. So this will allow the opening of the white squares, and you'll see in the game, Erdoğmuş is much more clever. He doesn't want this bishop to be awakened by the push to c4. He wants, after the c4 push, to be able to counter push with d4, keeping the c4 option. It blocks the diagonal of the bishop. That's why he's not going to take the pawn on a 4. Instead, he'll exchange on c3 and then infiltrate on a black square. In the opponent's camp, on b2, attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats to b1, rook b8. This puts pressure on the bishop and adds more pressure. On the pawn at c3, white play. h4. Rook b3. Double attack now from the pawn c3, which moves to c4. And as I told you, on the c4 push, we counter push with d4. We're attacking the knight, of course, but the real idea is to petrify the opponent's pawn structure on the white squares. Look, the pawn at d3 and the pawn at c4 will completely hinder. The bishop at b1. The knight moves to g4. We see that white are aiming for the black squares. The square h6, the square f6, but the knight g8, it is there. It holds its black squares. The queen comes to b4. And there, Erdoğmuş is creating an attack battery called the Alekin's cannon. What is Alekin's cannon? Alekin was a former world chess champion who won some beautiful games by doubling the rooks on a file and placing the queen behind them. So this attack battery, that is this combination of pieces with the two rooks in front and the queen behind, has since been called Alekin's cannon by those who remember some of this world champion Alekin's games. And now Veselin Topalov is going to play. queen 4. He leaves the bishop to its fate in order to counterattack on the knight. And you understand. Erdoğmuş does not want to trade the opponent's bishop, which isn't active, for his own knight. So he prefers to play knight to e7. And we see that the knight on e7 is acting as a relay for the knight on g8 to defend the black squares, in case the knight on g8 is eliminated by the knight on g4. We control the black squares, prevent any infiltration, and are going to win on the queen side. Bishop c2, because now the bishop was under attack. Rook c3, double attack on the bishop. Veselin Topalov returns to e2 to defend. And now the finishing move that will cause Topalov to resign. What did Erdoğan play? I invite you to pause the video to think about it calmly. So, what did you think of? Well, in reality, in this position, the white queen is overloaded with work, just like the rook for that matter. They have to defend the bishop. The problem is that the rook on e1 is itself targeted by the queen. That is to say, here, Erdoğmuş plays rook takes, bishop, and that wins a piece. Because if white don't recapture, we've won a bishop. And if white do recapture, we can take back without the white queen being able to recapture the rook with impunity, because the rook on e1 would fall with check. And so in the position after rook takes c2, there is no solution for Veselin Topalov. He is going to lose a piece. He is in the process of losing a piece. And on top of that, the position is very bad for him. So I think he played one more move. He played queen e4, and now there was rook c3. And here, Topalov realizes anyway that he can't play a piece down against Erdoğmuş. The strength of this young player, it's now impossible to hold the position with white. So obviously at the amateur level, you could keep playing this game, but at the professional level, at this top level, being down a piece in this position with no compensation, with no hope of making progress in the position, it's of course completely lost. So as you can see, in the match, there were 6 games. The first ended in a draw. The second was Erdoğmuş's victory in the dynamic and tactical variation with that mate on the first rank. The third game is the one we just saw. The positional and strategic victory by defending the black squares and muzzling the opponent's white square foot. Then there was a draw. And then 2 more victories for Erdoğmuş. Incredible. Goodbye, everyone.